Hi, everyone. This is Ben from Boss Construction, your South Florida Permitting and Code Compliance Specialist. I have a really special guest for all of our viewers here. We have Scott Marcus, a Becker shareholder, a real estate attorney over 25 years. Hi, Scott. How you doing?
Hey, Ben. Good. I'm doing well. Thanks. Good to be here.
I know we're live right now, but I just want to wait a couple minutes. I want to tell I just want to outline for our attendees both live on Facebook and Zoom, and we're going to have an educational video on this for the boards as well. Mayday, Mayday, contractual issues amidst a pandemic. We talk about a lot of business disruption right now, and that's
Correct.
kind of and you represent property owners, buyers, and sellers on all asset levels, residential and commercial. And we come into this a lot of times and developing solutions for changes in
Absolutely.
income or changes in
Yep.
terms and contracts.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And that's what, so we're going to speak about that today. What this pandemic represents really is a situation where in a commercial real estate transaction, it's pretty much that the asset that the purchaser is buying is comprised of the leases in most of your commercial transactions. So given the current environment, leases are changing, therefore the asset changes. So we've got issues on the landlord tenant front, and we've got issues on the purchase and sale front. We're going to discuss a little bit about how that plays out.
Perfect. And we have most of our attendees live now. So it is 11 o'clock and we're very excited to start and begin. Again,
Great.
for all of you who are just joining, thank you, Luis Suarez, our NAREP Fort Lauderdale chapter president, who's here. Welcome everyone. I have Scott Marcus, shareholder, Becker, and he is amazing, and we've worked for many years. First of all, Scott has 25 years of experience, which is amazing, and we've worked for many years. When I entered the real estate community representing property owners and sellers, I come to Scott with solutions. I come to Scott with questions. We are here to try and make the deal happen and get the deal done, right, Scott?
Absolutely. And I have to compliment you. There's been a number of times where we've had to bring you in on permitting or code violations that we find as we lead up towards a purchase. And you and your team have been just instrumental, wonderful to work with. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Scott. And what's very interesting, some things that get found in between going under contract, inspection period, after inspection period, once we have the lien search, how resolution is supposed to be conducted. But today we're going to talk about what happens when business gets disrupted and a pandemic arises and rent roll changes on an asset.
Sure. So just to set the stage for the viewers, in the commercial property arena, we've got properties, raw land, multifamily, retail, industrial, office. In all of those categories, with the exception of raw land, they're tenant driven because we've got an office building full of tenants, an industrial warehouse that's full of tenants, retail, same thing. So that is to say that these transactions in commercial are comprised of, and they're valued based on the tenant revenue. So as you can imagine, if you are entering into the purchase contract and a pandemic such as the one we're in hits, then the asset is likely or could change, and therefore what you were initially contracting for is different than what then currently is. So it's very interesting times, and calls for a lot of it calls for some new negotiations and calls for some creativity.
And you have a lot of experience creating those negotiations and solutions, especially in commercial real estate.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I one of my main areas of practice is the commercial real estate, and it's commercial real estate, unlike residential. Residential, we have a form contract we use. I sit on the committee that drafts that FAR/BAR contract as well. In commercial, I could receive a contract from a buying side, and it's a Word document. It's complete. It could be completely different than the last contract that I have seen. But for the most part, the general terms are going to be similar. And there's, a number of, we can also offer a contracts course for the viewers, but the general terms are going to be consistent amongst contracts. It's just how those terms are addressed in the contract that differ.
How far back do you think that with the pandemic and the COVID-19 and the changes of income on these properties under contract, when do you foresee problems starting to occur? Do you see that as problems now? Like, what should a seller do when they have their property listed right now and they're going through some things with the tenants?
Well, to answer that question, let's back up a bit.
Okay.
So let's talk about how a commercial property is valued.
Okay.
Commercial property is valued by what's called a capitalization rate or cap rate.
Okay.
And that's a formula. It's typically net operating income divided by current market value. And you come up with a percentage. So when in let's say a shopping center with 25 tenants with a certain cap rate, a buyer is looking to that property before they even go under contract. They're looking to that property for a certain rate of return. And in a pandemic such as this, once they're under contract, and depending what stage of the contract they're in, is it pre-due diligence, is it after, will depend on what they need to do. But since the revenues are driven, since the assets value is driven by the tenant revenues, a lot could change as to the value of that asset, and then the buyer's motivation can then change. So really, we need to answer your question, depends a lot on where the buyer is in the contract process. However, we could talk about some things that each contract should or could have that could help out either party and allow the deck to get restacked when something like this comes along.
And as far as you had mentioned that the seller's ability to modify lease terms without buyer approval. I wanted to touch on that with the audience because that's a very important part.
Yeah. So one of the sticking points that comes up when you're negotiating a commercial contract is the seller wants the freedom to do what the seller needs to do with their tenants before the buyer purchases the property. A buyer, on the flip side, the buyer does not want the seller creating new deals or new obligations for that buyer after a certain amount of time. Correct. So typically what the parties will do is, prior to due diligence period expiring, which is, either it's called the due diligence period, investigation period, inspection period. That's typically the go hard date. Prior to that time, a seller would have the right to enter into new leases. Some real estate contracts would mandate that the seller run the lease by the buyer and have, the buyer's approval is required, although the buyer's approval in some cases should not be unreasonably withheld. But after that due diligence period expires, the modification or new leases, that's typically a stopping point, because that means that the buyer's committed, and as such, they've gone hard on the property. So although it is the seller's property and title, the buyer is committed to that property, and therefore the buyer would want to say so in any modifications to that lease.
And a lot of these principles apply to with multifamily apartment buildings, anything where you are renting out a property, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial space, correct?
100%, 100%. The whole commercial arena that is tenant driven, all of these concepts are going to apply. And I look at it like this: you're as a purchaser of a commercial property, you're contracting for something, and let's call it an apple.
Yeah.
And a pandemic comes along, which nobody could have anticipated something like we're facing now coming along. But well, actually, Bill Gates did anticipate it, and
Yeah.
he actually
Yeah.
said it in several interviews. But for when something like we're facing now comes along, that apple changes, and maybe it's now an orange or a banana. And that's just a simple way of saying that what you originally were buying is no longer what you've got. And that might not mean that the deal is bad.
Yeah.
That just means that it's changed, and it opens up the floor for potential renegotiation or discussion, and that is driven by what the contract says. So
and again, most people were in front, they were scared that the deal might be dead since so many things have changed, but you've had constant success in bringing sellers and buyers together.
Absolutely. Well, I wouldn't say constant success. I mean, this environment is unique. So I think a lot of transactions where buyers have the right to terminate a contract completely, they might just be too nervous to pull the trigger and go forward with that asset. And that might not have anything to do with the asset, but it might have more to do with their current asset portfolio, their own financial situation, the market losses that they've taken. So, those factors factor into buyers' decisions on whether or not they're going to go forward with an acquisition. And depending on where in the transaction the buyer is, whether it's pre-inspection period deadline or post, will depend on what the buyer uses for that leverage. And putting a deal back together once something like a pandemic has occurred, the people, it becomes a business decision. If an asset has been thoroughly vetted pre-COVID, and now COVID strikes, we're in a situation where the numbers are changing. The buyer is going to request new information from the seller as to how the tenants have been affected, whether or not there's been any lease deferrals, any rent deferrals, and any changes to lease terms, any defaults. So that is going to drive the buyer's decision as to whether or not they're going to purchase the asset. And if they do, maybe they do, but under different terms. Maybe the price is now different.
Correct.
So, and that's just all business type negotiations. The legal part comes in is, what do I as a buyer hang my hat on in order to open up the floor for these negotiations? And there are a number of different clauses in your typical commercial contract. You've got your representations and warranties from a seller saying that the rent roll will be relatively the same at the time of closing as it is at the time you enter into the contract. Some contracts will say the opposite. They will say that the seller gives no assurance as to the rent roll or the viability of the tenants. So it's more of a buyer beware type of setting. You'll also have the tenant estoppel provisions, and estoppel is just a fancy word for a letter from the tenant which indicates that the lease is current, that there are no defaults, what the tenant is paying, what security deposit is up, and whether or not there's any obligations on either party's part, the seller or the landlord, which has which is still due. So you know, the
How often
the
are and again, with everything has a number in negotiating and valuating these assets, um, how often should a tenant landlord estoppel be conducted, and how many times have you seen that done if a property was under contract in February and now we're in May?
Sure. So estoppels in the landlord tenant arena are very important. Um, they're they're typically a contractual requirement in all the contracts that I've handled. What will differ is the number of tenant estoppels the landlord is required to get. If let's say you have a shopping center with 40 tenants, um, the landlord might not be able to get 40 estoppel letters for the buyer. So what the landlord can do is the landlord can certify the information in the estoppel letter that would come from the tenant. Now, in most landlord tenant leases, the tenant is obligated to provide an estoppel letter. So if a tenant is contractually obligated to provide it, in most cases, the tenant will, but there are times where maybe the tenant's frustrated with the landlord and a landlord won't be able to procure the estoppel from the tenant.
Yeah.
The estoppel, the estoppel letters typically go out towards the tail end of a transaction, because if a transaction's 60 days before closing, you don't want dated information. You don't want information that's 60 days ago. You want current information as of the current month. So you'll learn a lot about the asset somewhat later in the progression of the transaction. And sometimes you learn things that you wish you knew in the beginning. Sometimes we get, I always like provisions where I can get estoppels early on and then have them updated later, but that puts a big burden on a landlord and on their tenants. People don't want to bother their tenants. Yeah, they don't want to pester their tenants with, here's another thing you have to sign, but I just signed this 3 weeks ago. I know, but we're in a new month now. So there's a little bit of a push and pull contractually as to when those are executed, whether they could be renewed or updated, and what the party's obligations are.
And I like what you mentioned about these real scenarios with negotiations between the buyers and the seller. We actually spoke about this. I mean, tenants with new build outs, they've had issues getting COs or local business tax receipts, which the lease says they have to have. So are landlords able to affect the tenant's ability to operate, or is it really in control of the municipality on what they do?
Well, your question boils down to whether or not what you're requiring from the tenant, let's say it's a CO to operate,
Yeah.
The tenant shouldn't be operating without their proper licensure to do so. And if they are, they'd be in violation of municipal code. And in most cases, depending on who drafted the lease or how it's drafted, they'd be in violation of a lease as well. So just to answer your question in a vacuum, I would say that in most cases, a landlord can ensure that a tenant is operating in a manner that is appropriate for the municipality.
Okay.
And yeah, that's going to be standard, that in most of your leases, that the tenant is not in violation of any municipal ordinance, and that they have all of the required licenses in order to operate the business that they're operating.
And okay, so let's dive into the really, really crazy part. Amidst a pandemic, what should landlords and tenants do? Okay. Meaning, so for example, a commercial shopping center, the tenant might say, I want to operate under a different business, or I can't pay my rent, or what do I do amidst a government shutdown?
Sure.
things like that.
I was reading, so I think the first thing we need to understand, and taking a step back, is we talk in terms of tenants being affected by a pandemic, and because tenants are perceived as the little guy, and for the most part they are. But it is important to remember that the landlord has obligations as well. The landlord's got a mortgage typically to pay. They've got investors or various shareholders to answer to. They've got maintenance obligations. And if the rent is not coming in, those obligations or the landlord's ability to meet those obligations then might fall short. So I was reading an article by Barry Wolf, who is one of the landlord tenant gurus in our industry in South Florida. And it was a great little piece, because he indicated that this is a very good time for a landlord to possibly renegotiate some lease terms. So if a tenant comes to a landlord and says, I need to defer my rent, I'm not going to be able to make May's rent, June's rent, the landlord can say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the rent that you would have paid for May and June. We're going to extend the lease term. Maybe instead of those 2 months, we'll extend your term another year. And maybe the landlord would use that opportunity to say that they wish they had done certain things at the outset of the lease. Now is a good time for them to contract for them. Maybe they want to convert the lease from a double net lease to a triple net lease. Maybe they want to make some other obligation, place some other obligation on the tenant that wasn't already on the tenant. Maybe they want to require financials of the guarantors, updated financials. Maybe they want to tie the request to a request for financial information on the business, which maybe they didn't have a right to do in the preliminary lease. So, these are it just anytime one party.
So basically, like landlord's gonna say, okay, I'm gonna be flexible, but I want to verify some information.
I want to be flexible. I want to verify some information, and then I possibly want to change some terms favorable to myself as a landlord, as I give you tenant terms which are favorable to you. So it's a trade. And I thought that was a very interesting piece that Barry wrote, and it was kind of a nice spin on things that, don't look at this time as a complete negative. If a tenant approaches a landlord and asks for something, it's an opportunity for both sides to huddle up again and retrade the deal. Not fully, but at least some of the terms.
So basically, ask for something, get something, cause and effect.
Sure.
Everything kind of affects.
Yep.
And what do you recommend as far as and we had discussed that landlords and tenants, for example, we don't want any of the behavior to affect renegotiations or terms. So what do you recommend, whether it's on we all pay rent or mortgage. We all shop at these shopping centers. How do you recommend the tenant to be conversing with the landlord, or communicating, or things to share or not to share?
Well, it's interesting, and it depends a lot on who your landlord is and how they interact in their business relationship with you. It could be that you're dealing with a property manager, or it could be you're dealing directly with a landlord. It could be that the landlord has always been very amenable and open to discussion and open to hearing, issues or confronting and problem solving with the tenant. But for the most part, what I have seen for the last several months is tenants approaching landlords, indicating that not only are we in the midst of a pandemic, but the pandemic has caused a government shutdown. And in a lot of your leases, and not to belabor what we've talked about before, and people might have heard this a number of times, but in a standard force majeure clause, which is something outside of the party's control has caused an event, and therefore my failure to do something, pay rent or perform under my lease and any type of and any other obligation, is stayed until that force majeure is lifted. So if the force majeure clause is drafted appropriately to include government shutdowns or government regulations, then the tenant does have a very good opportunity to go to approach the landlord and say, listen, we need to let's just have a candid discussion. I will tell you this, Ben, it is so much easier to work with your existing tenant than it is to go dark, deal with an eviction, go dark on the space, find new tenants. So
that's going to be a lot of expense.
It's a huge expense, and to work with an existing tenant, so long as you're not dealing with an extreme case of somebody that never had the ability to pay and was always a problem to begin with, and now is just using a pandemic such as this as an excuse not, to rightfully maybe do what they weren't doing before. But I think it's a time where there's open discussion. It'll depend on the parties. It'll depend on how the parties converse. And I think, honesty is leveling with somebody and saying, listen, I have no ability to have customers in my store. We're doing takeout, but we have to do it one at a time. And it's hampered my business by 68%. So, all I'm asking for is, and then X. But, and if a landlord is not going to be willing to have those discussions with the tenant, then you have to turn to an attorney and possibly dive into the lease, see what the obligations of the landlord are. But for the most part, I have not been receiving the calls as an attorney of, my landlord is being uncooperative. I need you to get involved on the legal side. This is more, I've been more of an advisor of here's what you should do. And it's more just human to human contact and business discussion. And for the most part, the landlords understand, and they're agreeable to change. And so that's what we're seeing more so now.
And tenants have said, for example, we have a client in like a Class A healthcare office building, and they're like, we started to open up, but the side doors are open in the building. There's not the security guard that should be there again. But we also, like you said, we need to be mindful that we shouldn't use those excuses is how not to, or how to interact with our landlords.
Yeah, I think honesty is appropriate. Look, there's always going to be those that are doing just as well despite a downturn as they were doing originally, and they look to take advantage of a situation. I don't see that. I haven't seen it. For the questions that I've, for the several dozens of landlord tenants calls I've received, it's been more so what's the best way for me to handle this? And I will tell you to the one that I haven't, it's been less of me telling them, well, your lease says this, so therefore I can write a letter to your landlord, a legal letter saying, please be advised, and starting off negotiations that way. It's more of pick up a phone, contact your landlord, have a just a human discussion as to how the pandemic is affecting you, when you think that you're going to be able to get back on track, and then
so
and
basically
then the landlord might ask for something too.
So basically no hard lines, and just keep the door open. Keep
the door open. Sure. Yeah.
And that's really great advice for our viewers. And I'm really glad everyone who came today and who share, and Scott from Becker, amazing shareholder, amazing real estate attorney. Again, we've got the chance to work together on real estate transactions, both commercial and residential. We've got the chance to educate agents and property owners throughout South Florida. And thank you so much for being here today, Scott.
Very, very welcome. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank you for hosting and also just singing your praises, because I've encountered certain sticky situations where I've called you in and you will go down to the municipality, you will talk to the people that you need to talk to, you will undo a situation that was done, and you're just a pleasure to work with. And I love the partnership.
Thank you so much. Or simply, like you're saying, everything's a negotiation. Everything is a valuation. Why don't we get to the closing table if the city of Miami is closed? And again, most of the municipalities are open, but why don't we give a credit to the buyer? Why don't we evaluate the situation? Why don't we get to the closing table? So most often, sometimes the resolution is conversation and valuation, like we discussed here.
Yeah.
And Scott, how can our viewers reach you? Because your law firm offers so much perspective and your experience. Sure. How can they reach you if they have a question of something has changed in a property that they're purchasing, or a real estate agent has a question about something that they represented in a listing, or things like that?
So our law firm is now under the flag of the Becker firm. It still is Becker Poliakoff in its corporate records, but if you Google, Becker attorney Scott Marcus, you'll get me.
Very cool.
You can find me on the website, email me. But we do have such a vast array of practice groups. That's what makes our law firm very nimble amidst something like this, because commercial real estate might be down, litigation might be rising. We represent homeowners associations. They've got questions in something, such as the environment that we're living in now. So Becker is really very diverse in the interests that they can assist clients with. And that's really one of the reasons that I'm very proud to be a part of that firm. And also the people are just, I've been with the firm for 16 years. There are partners that have been over 30. So, it's just a great environment to practice it.
But again, you have to be able, especially during these times, to shift gears and serve your clients in many capacities and whatever they need.
100%. Yep. You got to be nimble.
All right. Thank you so much, Scott Marcus.
Thanks,
from
Ben.
Becker, shareholder. This is Ben from Boss Construction, your South Florida permitting and code compliance specialist. Thank you so much to Reliable Lien Search and NAREP Fort Lauderdale. And of course, Becker, for presenting this interview today. Thank you so much, guys. Be safe and have a great day.